1543. Nuremberg. The air in the room is thick and still, heavy with the sweet, cloying smell of medicinal herbs and the sharper, more sacred scent of incense, a futile attempt to purify the unmistakable odor of approaching death. Light, thick with dust motes dancing like tiny celestial bodies, streams through the leaded glass, illuminating a face as pale as parchment, a landscape of wrinkles carved by 70 years of relentless thought. This is the deathbed of Nicolaus Copernicus. His breath is a shallow, ragged whisper, a final, fading rhythm against the backdrop of a world he is about to shatter. Into his trembling, almost lifeless hands, friends place a heavy object, a new book, its binding still stiff, the pages smelling not of dust and age, but of the sharp, metallic tang of fresh printer's ink and damp paper. The title, stamped in stark black letters, is a declaration of war against 1,000 years of certainty. De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. On the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. He is too weak to open it, too close to the final darkness to read the words that are his life's entire meaning. His fingers, skeletal and cold, trace the embossed title. This is it. The culmination of a lifetime of secret calculations, of observations made from a cold stone tower in a remote corner of Poland, of a fear so profound it had kept him silent for decades. It is a work that physically displaces the earth from the center of God's creation, that sends it spinning into the void, a humble servant of the sun. In this quiet, somber room, one universe is dying with the man, while another is being born in the ink of his book. The sensory assault is one of profound, world-altering contradiction. The sacred silence of a death chamber clashing with the roar of a revolution about to erupt. The smell of fading life mingling with the scent of an idea that will live forever. The finality of the flesh meets the immortality of the word. This is the saga of him, Nicolaus Copernicus, the mild-mannered canon, the loyal servant of the Church, who committed the ultimate intellectual blasphemy. This was the narrative of a man who did not set out to be a revolutionary, but whose quiet, obsessive pursuit of mathematical beauty became the most explosive act in the history of human thought. To understand this man, we must confront the central, dramatic paradox of his entire existence. Why? Why did a man so deeply woven into the fabric of the medieval church, a man who lived by its rules, administered its estates, and benefited from its patronage, dare to conceive and meticulously prove a theory that struck at the very heart of its cosmology, and by extension, its authority? This was not just a scientific disagreement, it was a philosophical and theological earthquake. To suggest the earth moved was to contradict the literal interpretation of Scripture, to demote humanity from its privileged position as the centerpiece of God's creation, and to question the wisdom of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and the Church Fathers, all in one terrifying stroke. What was the secret motivation, the inner demon, that drove this cautious, reclusive scholar to risk accusations of heresy, the ridicule of his peers, and the potential damnation of his soul? What was it in the world around him, or in the deepest recesses of his own mind, that compelled him to stop the sun, to send the earth hurtling through the cosmos, and in doing so to overturn not just the heavens, but the very definition of man's place within them? This is the core question, the enigma we must unravel, to comprehend the quiet monk who defied the stars and forever changed our world. To understand the man, we must first return to the world that spawned him. The late 15th century was not a time of placid certainty. It was an age of violent, convulsive change, a world where the old certainties were cracking under immense pressure. It was a geopolitical chessboard in a state of utter flux. In the East, the final ember of the Roman Empire had been extinguished in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, sending a shockwave of fear and a priceless flood of ancient Greek manuscripts westward into Europe. This event alone reshaped the intellectual landscape, reintroducing thinkers like Plato and Aristarchus to a continent that had largely forgotten them. In the West, England was just beginning to heal from the dynastic bloodletting of the Wars of the Roses, while France and the Holy Roman Empire were locked in the endless grinding conflicts of the Italian Wars, turning the peninsula into a battlefield for giants. And from the newly unified Kingdom of Spain, financed by the seizure of Granada from the Moors, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus had sailed west and collided with a new world in 1492, shattering the claustrophobic confines of the old maps and proving that the world was vaster and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. This was a direct, physical assault on the authority of ancient geographers like Ptolemy. If Ptolemy could be wrong about the size of the Earth, could he also be wrong about its place in the heavens? At the very same time, a technological revolution was underway. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press was a machine for mass-producing thought, spreading new and dangerous ideas, humanist philosophies, classical texts, and soon Martin Luther's heresies, with the speed and uncontrollability of a plague. It was a world of rising nation-states, of burgeoning trade, of gunpowder armies, and of a simmering spiritual discontent that was about to boil over into the Protestant Reformation, a cataclysm that would tear the seamless garment of Christendom apart. Copernicus was born into this whirlwind, a world where foundations were trembling, where authority was being questioned, and where the impossible was suddenly becoming reality. Into this storm-tossed world, in the year 1473, Nicolaus Copernicus was born in the city of Torun, a bustling port on the Vistula River in the province of Royal Prussia, a territory recently wrested from the Teutonic Knights and placed under the protection of the King of Poland. He was not born into the cloister, but into the world of commerce and influence. His father, also named Nicholas, was a wealthy copper merchant from Krakow, a man of substance and connection. His mother, Barbara Watson Rode, belonged to a powerful and wealthy patrician family. This was a world of privilege, of Hanseatic League trade routes, of civic responsibility and financial security. But this comfortable world was shattered when Copernicus was only 10 years old. A plague or some other sickness swept through Torun, and he lost his father. The boy and his 3 siblings were left orphaned, their future uncertain. This early experience of loss and instability may well have forged in him a deep-seated desire for order, for a predictable and harmonious system, a yearning that would later find its grandest expression in his cosmology. But his fate was not to be one of poverty. His maternal uncle, Lucas Watson-Rode the Younger, a man of formidable intellect and even more formidable ambition, took the children under his wing. Watson-Rode was no simple parish priest. He was a rising star in the church, soon to become the powerful Prince Bishop of Warmia. He was a statesman, a diplomat, a military commander, and a patron of the arts, a true Renaissance prince in clerical robes. He saw the quiet, scholarly brilliance in his young nephew and decided to cultivate it, not for the glory of God alone, but for the advancement of the Watson-Rode family and the security of his own political power. Copernicus's character was thus forged in a crucible of contradictory forces, the loss of his father instilling caution and a desire for stability, While the patronage of his powerful uncle provided him with a world-class education, political protection, and the intellectual freedom to pursue his own interests, however esoteric they might be. He became meticulous, reserved, and deeply analytical, a man who preferred the silent company of numbers to the noisy world of courtly intrigue. The first step into the great game of intellectual discovery was not taken in the cold, northern lands of Prussia, but under the warm, intoxicating sun of Italy, the vibrant heart of the Renaissance. His uncle, Lucas Watson Rode, sent him there in 1496, not to become a starry-eyed philosopher, but to achieve a very practical goal: to study canon law at the University of Bologna. The prince-bishop needed a well-trained legal mind to help him administer his vast diocese and navigate the treacherous political currents of his conflict with the Teutonic Order. For Copernicus, this was the great liberation. Bologna was a revelation, a city teeming with new ideas, artistic fervor, and an intellectual daring that was unthinkable back home. While he dutifully attended his law lectures, his true passion was ignited elsewhere. He sought out the university's leading astronomer, Domenico Maria Novara da Ferrara, a man known for questioning the infallibility of the Ptolemaic system. Copernicus became more than a student. He became Novara's assistant and collaborator. It was in Novara's home that he likely first encountered the Neoplatonic and Pythagorean ideas that prized mathematical simplicity and harmony as the highest form of truth, the key to unlocking the mind of God. And it was in Bologna, on the 9th of March, 1497, that he made his first recorded astronomical observation, a moment that planted a crucial seed of doubt. He watched as the moon passed in front of the star Aldebaran. He carefully noted that his observation did not quite match the predictions of Ptolemy's lunar theory. It was a small discrepancy, a minor crack in the ancient edifice, but for a mind as meticulous as Copernicus's, it was profoundly unsettling. From Bologna, he traveled to Padua to study medicine, another practical skill his uncle desired, and finally to Ferrara, where he completed his doctorate in canon law in 1503. But through it all, his secret life continued. He was devouring every ancient astronomical text he could find, teaching himself Greek so he could read them in the original. He was not just a student of law and medicine, he was a spy in the house of knowledge, secretly gathering the intellectual ammunition for a revolution he himself did not yet fully comprehend. The driving force behind Copernicus's radical vision was not rebellion, not a desire to thumb his nose at the church, but something far deeper and more personal. An inner demon, a profound and obsessive conviction rooted in aesthetics and philosophy. This was his Platonic obsession with mathematical harmony. To understand Copernicus, one must understand that he was, at his core, a Neoplatonist. He believed that God was the ultimate geometer, and that the universe, as God's creation, must be a reflection of divine perfection, logic, and beauty. When he looked at the prevailing cosmological model, the system of Claudius Ptolemy, he was not just scientifically skeptical, he was aesthetically repulsed. The Ptolemaic system was a masterpiece of mathematical ingenuity, a system that had, for over 1,400 years, successfully predicted the positions of the planets with remarkable accuracy. But it was a monstrously complicated machine. To account for the strange retrograde motions of the planets, their tendency to slow down, stop, and move backward against the stars, Ptolemy had resorted to a dizzying array of conceptual gears, epicycles, circles upon which planets moved, which in turn moved along a larger circle, deferents, the larger circles, and equants, an offset point from which the motion appeared uniform. It worked, but it was ugly. It was an ad hoc, patched-together contraption. Copernicus looked at this celestial Rube Goldberg machine and felt it was an insult to the Creator. Could the divine architect truly have built a universe so clumsy, so arbitrary, so inelegant? His motivation was akin to that of a master watchmaker who, upon examining a timepiece, finds it full of redundant gears and bizarrely offset mechanisms, and knows in his gut that there must be a simpler, more beautiful design. His demon was the relentless pursuit of this divine geometric truth. He was searching for the universe's underlying symphony, and all he could hear in the Ptolemaic system was a cacophony. This deep-seated belief that nature loves simplicity and that God would not have created such a monstrous system was the secret motivation, the philosophical engine that drove him for decades in his lonely tower, searching for a more harmonious arrangement of the heavens. No man, however brilliant, makes a revolution alone. The grand, dangerous idea of Copernicus was nurtured and shielded for decades by the immense shadow of one man, his uncle and patron, Lucas Watson-Rode. Theirs was the fateful encounter that defined Copernicus's entire life. Without Watson-Rode, there would have been no Italian education, no financial security, and most importantly, no protected space for decades of quiet, subversive research. Watson-Rode was a towering figure, a prince-bishop who ruled the ecclesiastical state of Warmia as an almost sovereign entity. He was a shrewd politician who constantly maneuvered between the ambitions of the Polish crown and the aggression of the Teutonic Knights. He was a man of the world, a pragmatist who understood power and how to wield it. When his nephew returned from Italy in 1503, a doctor of canon law, Watson-Rode did not immediately send him to a provincial parish. Instead, he kept Copernicus by his side as his personal physician and private secretary. For nearly a decade, Copernicus lived in the episcopal palace at Lidzbark, at the very center of power. He traveled with his uncle on diplomatic missions, sat in on high-level political negotiations, and saw firsthand the intricate machinery of church and state. This was an invaluable, if unintentional, part of his education. It taught him discretion, caution, and a keen understanding of the dangers of challenging established authority. More critically, when Watson-Rode eventually installed him as a canon in the Frombork Cathedral chapter in 1510, it was a position for life. It came with a handsome salary, comfortable living quarters, and minimal religious duties. It was, in effect, the perfect lifelong research grant. Watson-Rode had secured for his nephew a position of immense privilege and freedom. While the other canons busied themselves with church politics, Copernicus was free to use his income to buy astronomical instruments, to build his own small observatory, and to spend his nights charting the heavens. It was a pact, unspoken but clear. As long as Copernicus served the practical needs of the diocese, as an administrator, a physician, a cartographer, and did not cause a public scandal, his powerful uncle would protect him. This was not a relationship of warm affection, but a strategic alliance. The prince-bishop, the man of earthly power, provided the shield behind which the astronomer, the man of celestial ideas, could safely rethink the universe. Upon his uncle's death in 1512, Copernicus finally settled into the life for which he had been destined, a life of quiet power and profound secrecy in the remote, windswept cathedral town of Frombork on the Baltic coast. This was the price of his power and his freedom, a comfortable, respectable existence as a canon of the Warmian Cathedral chapter. On the surface, he was the model of a Renaissance churchman, a polymath deeply engaged in the practical affairs of the world. He was not a monk in a monastery, but an administrator in a powerful land-owning corporation. His days were filled with mundane but important tasks. As a physician, he tended to the health of his fellow canons and the local nobility, his medical knowledge from Padua making him a sought-after consultant. As an economist, he was tasked with managing the chapter's vast agricultural estates, overseeing tenants and collecting rents. He even authored a brilliant treatise, Monetae Cudendae Ratio, on the necessity of currency reform, arguing that bad money drives out good, a principle now known as Gresham's Law. He was also a diplomat and a military strategist. When the Teutonic Knights laid siege to the region, Canon Copernicus was put in charge of the defenses of Ulston Castle, successfully repelling the invaders. He was a man of the establishment, a pillar of his community, a loyal and effective servant of the Church. But this entire public life, this world of ledgers, prescriptions, and battlements, was a mask. It was the necessary camouflage for his true, secret existence. After the day's work was done, he would retreat to his tower, a simple observatory he had built into the cathedral's fortifications. There, under the vast, dark Polish sky, the administrator vanished and the astronomer emerged. With his rudimentary instruments, a trichetrum, a quadrant, a parallactic instrument he built himself, he spent countless hours, night after night, year after year, meticulously observing the motions of the planets, accumulating the data that would fuel his secret revolution. This dual life was the core of his strategy for survival. His impeccable public service was the shield that protected his private, heretical thoughts. The primary antagonist Copernicus faced was not a single person, not a jealous rival or a menacing inquisitor, but something far more powerful and pervasive, a fortress of the mind, a 1,000-year-old intellectual and spiritual world order. This was the combined, seemingly unassailable authority of Aristotelian physics and Ptolemaic cosmology, an entire universe of common sense that had been absorbed and sanctified by the theology of the Catholic Church. This geocentric model was not just a scientific theory, it was the bedrock of medieval reality. At its heart was the simple, intuitive idea that the Earth was heavy, sluggish, and stationary, resting at the very center of creation. Around this fixed and privileged stage, the celestial bodies, the moon, the sun, the 5 known planets, and the stars, all made of a perfect, ethereal substance, revolved in complex but predictable circles. This was a universe with a clear moral and spiritual hierarchy. Below the moon was the sublunar realm of change, decay, and sin, our world. Above the moon was the superlunary realm of perfection, changelessness, and divinity, the heavens. Man, created in God's image, lived at the center of it all, the focus of a cosmic drama of salvation and damnation. This model was philosophically satisfying, theologically profound, and it confirmed what everyone could see with their own eyes. The sun rose in the east and set in the west, while the ground beneath their feet remained reassuringly solid. To challenge this was to challenge everything. If the Earth were just another planet, spinning dizzily on its axis and orbiting the sun, then where was humanity's special place? Where was heaven? Where was hell? If the stars were not fixed to a crystalline sphere but were distant suns, then the universe might be infinite, a terrifying thought that dissolved the cozy, contained world of the Middle Ages. The antagonist was an entire worldview, defended by the pulpits of every church, the lecture halls of every university, and the ingrained intuition of every living person. It was a fortress whose walls were built of scripture, whose foundations were laid by Aristotle, and whose defenders saw any attack not as a scientific debate, but as a blasphemous assault on God, man, and the very fabric of reality. Around the year 1514, after years of silent calculation, Copernicus decided to test the waters. He committed his radical ideas to paper for the first time, not in a grand published book, but in a short, handwritten manuscript known as the Commentarialus, or Little Commentary. It was a cautious, almost surreptitious act. He did not put his name to it, and he did not publish it. He simply circulated a few copies among a small circle of trusted friends and fellow astronomers. This document was a bombshell in miniature. In just a few pages, he laid out the 7 core axioms of his new cosmology. The Earth is not the center of the universe. The center is near the sun. The Earth's motion explains the apparent movement of the stars, and so on. It was a direct, unambiguous declaration of his heliocentric theory. This was his first major, and in some ways fatal, mistake. The reaction was a microcosm of what was to come. Among a select few expert astronomers, it generated immense excitement and respect. The Commentariolus established his reputation across Europe as a mathematical genius, a man to be watched. But with this underground fame came the first, chilling whispers of condemnation. Theologians who caught wind of it were scandalized. The idea of a moving earth was not just a novelty, it was a flagrant contradiction of passages in the Bible, such as the story of Joshua commanding the sun, not the earth, to stand still. This was the moment the true nature of his predicament became clear to Copernicus. He understood that he was facing not merely scientific criticism, which he welcomed, but the far more dangerous charge of heresy. He also opened himself up to ridicule. The notion of a spinning earth seemed absurd to the common person, a violation of all sensory experience. Why weren't we all thrown off into space? Why didn't the birds get left behind? These were serious objections from an Aristotelian perspective. The psychological impact on Copernicus was profound. The fear of being laughed at as a fool, combined with the graver fear of being condemned as a heretic, was enough to drive him into a state of deep intellectual retreat. He had tested the waters and found them to be dangerously cold. This breaking point, this realization of the profound peril he was in, convinced him to keep his full, mathematically detailed work a secret. He would spend the next 3 decades in near total silence, obsessively refining his calculations, building an unassailable mountain of evidence before he would ever again risk public exposure. Just as Copernicus retreated into his fortress of solitude in Frombork, the world outside its walls was being torn apart by a crisis of faith that would inadvertently provide him with the perfect cover. The Protestant Reformation, which erupted in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, was an event of world historical chaos, and in that chaos lay an unforeseen opportunity. The Reformation shattered the 1,000-year-old unity of Western Christendom. Suddenly, the Catholic Church was no longer an unchallengeable monolith. It was fighting a desperate existential war on multiple fronts. Its spiritual authority, its political power, and its financial resources were all consumed by the struggle against the Protestant heresy. The intellectual energy of the Church's best and brightest minds was not focused on the obscure mathematical theories of a reclusive Polish canon. It was focused on countering the theological arguments of Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. Popes and cardinals were more concerned with the spread of Protestantism in Germany and the political machinations of Henry VIII in England than with the arrangement of the planets. This monumental distraction created a space, a small but crucial crack in the wall of dogmatic enforcement, through which a new idea could emerge. Furthermore, the Reformation itself was a profound questioning of authority. The Protestants' cry of sola scriptura challenged the interpretive authority of the Pope and the Church councils. While this did not initially lead to greater scientific freedom, indeed, many Protestant leaders like Luther were virulently anti-Copernican, citing Scripture. It did contribute to a general climate of intellectual ferment and upheaval. If the authority of the Pope, which had stood for centuries, could be successfully challenged, then why not the authority of Ptolemy, which was even older? The crisis on earth distracted from the potential crisis in the heavens. The Church was too busy trying to put out the fire in its own house to worry about the quiet intellectual embers smoldering in a distant tower in Poland. The chaos of the Reformation became Copernicus's unwitting shield, allowing him to work in relative peace for the better part of 30 years, a period of quiet that would have been unimaginable in the more rigid, centralized, and intellectually policed Church of the preceding century. The greatest triumph of Copernicus's life was not a public accolade or a grand ceremony, but a quiet arrival. In the spring of 1539, a young, brilliant, and astonishingly audacious scholar appeared at the gates of Frombork. His name was Georg Joachim Rheticus, a 25-year-old professor of mathematics from the University of Wittenberg, the very heart of the Lutheran heresy. His journey was an act of incredible intellectual and personal courage. As a Protestant, he was risking travel into the staunchly Catholic territory of Warmia, a place where he could have been arrested as a heretic. But he was drawn by a force more powerful than fear. The whispers and rumors he had heard about a reclusive old canon who had devised a revolutionary new model of the universe. Rheticus was not just a curious admirer. He was a pilgrim in search of a new scientific gospel. He had read the Commentariolus and was convinced that Copernicus held the key to the cosmos. The arrival of this enthusiastic, energetic, and brilliant young disciple was the catalyst that finally broke Copernicus's decades-long silence. The old astronomer, now in his late 60s, was hesitant and deeply suspicious at first. But he was quickly won over by Rheticus's genuine passion, his quick grasp of the complex mathematics, and his unwavering belief in the truth of the heliocentric system. For 2 years, the old Catholic canon and the young Protestant professor worked side by side in the Frombork Tower, an unlikely alliance forged in the shared pursuit of knowledge. Rheticus became the student, the confidant, and ultimately the agent of change. He systematically read through Copernicus's massive, unfinished manuscript, urging him to clarify his arguments, strengthen his proofs, and prepare it for publication. It was Rheticus who saw that this was not just a private intellectual exercise, but a gift that had to be given to the world. He was the external force that finally overcame Copernicus's internal inertia, a lifetime of caution and fear. The arrival of Rheticus was the climax of Copernicus's intellectual journey, the moment his solitary obsession finally found its voice and its champion. The psychological turning point for Copernicus, the moment of hubris that finally conquered his fear, came not from his own manuscript, but from the work of his young protégé. After months of studying the Copernican system, Rheticus could no longer contain his excitement. With his master's permission, he wrote a short, accessible summary of the new cosmology, an appetizer for the main course to come. In 1540, he published this summary in Gdansk under the title Narratio Prima, or First Report. This was the first ever printed account of the Copernican theory, and it was an immediate and sensational success in the intellectual circles of Europe. The narratio prima spread like wildfire among mathematicians and astronomers. It was celebrated for its clarity, its elegance, and the sheer intellectual power of the system it described. For the first time, Copernicus could gauge the reaction to his ideas not from hushed whispers and theological condemnations, but from the enthusiastic praise of his fellow experts. He saw that he was not going to be universally ridiculed. He saw that his work was being taken seriously, that it was being hailed as a work of genius. This was the vindication he had been waiting for his entire life. The success of the narratio prima was a profound psychological triumph. It showed him that there was an audience for his work, a community of scholars who would understand and appreciate the mathematical beauty and predictive power of his system, regardless of the theological implications. It was the moment his deep-seated fear of ridicule was finally outweighed by the evidence of admiration. This external validation gave him the final surge of confidence he needed. He had seen his ideas in print, under the name of another, and the world had not ended. Instead, it had applauded. It was this moment of triumph, this feeling of intellectual vindication, that allowed Rheticus to finally persuade the old man to release his magnum opus, the work of a lifetime, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, to the printers. The hubris was not one of arrogance, but of an artist finally convinced of his own creation's worth, ready to let it stand or fall on its own merits. The sworn enemy of Copernicus was not a single man with a sword or a snarling Dominican inquisitor at his door. His antagonist was far more insidious. It was the specter of an institution, the abstract but terrifying power of dogmatic enforcement, embodied by the Holy Office of the Inquisition. While the Inquisition's power was not as absolute in Poland as it was in Italy or Spain, the fear it inspired cast a long shadow over the entire continent. Copernicus was acutely aware of the fate of men who had dared to challenge church doctrine. Although it would happen after his death, the fate of Giordano Bruno serves as a powerful, albeit anachronistic, premonition of the danger. Bruno, a philosopher and Dominican friar, embraced Copernicanism and took it even further, speculating that the stars were distant suns with their own planets, and that the universe was infinite. For these and other theological heresies, he was burned at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in the year 1600. This was the ultimate price of intellectual freedom. The close-up of the enemy is the cold, calculating mind of a figure like Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the man who would later be the chief prosecutor of Galileo Galilei. Bellarmine was not an ignorant fool. He was a brilliant intellectual and a powerful prince of the Church. His objection to Copernicanism was not primarily scientific, but theological and pastoral. He argued that a moving earth explicitly contradicted the plain meaning of Holy Scripture. If the Bible could be wrong on a matter of empirical fact, then its authority on matters of faith and morals could also be questioned, shaking the very foundation of the Church. Furthermore, he argued, to tell the common peasant that the ground beneath her feet was spinning through space would cause a crisis of faith, sow confusion, and threaten her salvation. For men like Bellarmine, preserving the stability of the faith and the authority of the Church was an absolute duty, one that far outweighed any claims of mathematical elegance or astronomical observation. This was the true enemy. Not ignorance, but a powerful, intelligent, and ruthless commitment to a different set of truths, an institution that believed preserving spiritual order was worth the price of suppressing scientific discovery. Copernicus knew this enemy intimately, and it was the reason he hesitated for so long. While the world outside debated theology and waged wars, Copernicus engaged in his own form of construction, an act of intellectual world-building that was as ambitious as the construction of any cathedral. His great work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, was not a mere philosophical pamphlet or a brief sketch like the Commentariolus. It was a monumental 6-volume masterpiece of mathematics, deliberately modeled on and designed to replace the Bible of ancient astronomy, Ptolemy's Almagest. This was a strategic choice. He knew that to overthrow the 1,500-year-old Ptolemaic system, he could not simply poke holes in it. He had to offer a comprehensive and mathematically rigorous alternative that could do everything the old system did, but better. He was not just proposing an idea, he was delivering a fully functional system. The first book laid out the philosophical foundations of his heliocentric model, arguing for its superior elegance and harmony. But the subsequent books were a dense, almost impenetrable forest of geometry, trigonometry, and observational data. He meticulously built his system piece by piece like a master architect. He calculated the length of the year with astonishing precision. He constructed a new star catalog. He then, one by one, took on the planets, developing geometric models to explain their orbits around the Sun. He used his model to explain the mysterious retrograde motion of the planets not as a real movement, but as an optical illusion caused by the Earth's own motion as it overtakes the outer planets, or is overtaken by the inner ones. This was a moment of breathtaking simplicity that swept away the need for Ptolemy's clumsy epicycles. He created detailed tables of planetary positions, proving that his system could predict the future locations of the planets just as well as, and sometimes better than, Ptolemy's. This was his fortress. He was building a wall of mathematical proof so high and so thick that his critics would not be able to breach it. He knew he would be attacked on theological and philosophical grounds, but he intended to make his mathematical case unassailable. The book was his great reform, his act of construction, a complete and self-contained universe of numbers designed to prove that God was indeed a geometer, but a far more elegant one than Ptolemy had ever imagined. To paint a true portrait of Copernicus, we must look beyond the lonely astronomer in his tower and see the man enmeshed in the complex, worldly tapestry of his life in Frombork. These contextual details, these onions and vegetables, reveal a character far more grounded and conflicted than the serene sage of popular legend. Life in the Frombork Cathedral chapter was a microcosm of the wider world, full of political intrigue, financial disputes, and personal drama. Copernicus, as a canon, was a voting member of a semi-autonomous corporation that frequently found itself in conflict with its neighbors, particularly the aggressive Teutonic Order, and even with the Polish king. He was not above these squabbles. His signature appears on numerous administrative documents, petitions, and letters dealing with land rights, taxes, and appointments. He was a man of affairs. His medical practice also brought him into close contact with the powerful. He was the personal physician to a series of Warmian bishops and was often called upon to treat the ailments of Polish dukes and councillors, a role that gave him both influence and insight into the workings of power. But the most intriguing and humanizing detail of his life was his long and controversial relationship with his housekeeper, Anna Schilling. According to the strict rules of the Church, canons were to remain celibate and avoid any hint of scandal. Yet for many years, Anna, his distant relative, lived in his house. This did not go unnoticed. His superiors, including Bishop Johannes Dantiscus, repeatedly admonished him, warning him to dismiss her to avoid gossip and the suspicion of sin. Copernicus resisted for years, a rare act of personal defiance from a man known for his caution. He eventually relented and sent her away, but the episode reveals a hidden private side to his character, a capacity for deep personal attachment, a stubborn streak, and a willingness to bend the rules for reasons that remain lost to history. These details are crucial. They show us that Copernicus was not a saint or a disembodied intellect. He was a man of his time, navigating the pressures of politics, the demands of his career, the complexities of personal relationships, and the strictures of his faith, all while secretly nurturing a revolutionary idea that threatened to burn his entire world down. As the years passed, and Copernicus's great work neared completion, the first cracks in his carefully constructed wall of silence began to appear, and the harbingers of the coming storm gathered on the horizon. The success of Rheticus's Narratio Prima had been a double-edged sword. While it brought him acclaim from mathematicians, it also brought his ideas to the attention of a much wider and more hostile audience. The whispers from Rome, once merely academic, began to take on a more ominous tone. While some high-ranking churchmen, like Cardinal Nicolaus von Schönberg, had heard of Copernicus's work early on and had even encouraged him to publish it, this was not the universal sentiment. The theological implications were now being seriously debated, and the orthodox position was hardening. The most public and vitriolic attack, however, came not from a Catholic cardinal, but from the father of the Protestant Reformation himself, Martin Luther. In one of his famous table talk conversations in 1539, Luther dismissed Copernicus with contemptuous brevity. "The fool will turn the whole science of astronomy upside down," he declared. "But as Holy Scripture tells us, Joshua bade the sun to stand still and not the earth." This was a devastating blow. It demonstrated that opposition to his theory would be ecumenical. Both Catholics and Protestants could unite in condemning it on biblical grounds. John Calvin would later echo this sentiment, thundering from the pulpit, "Who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit?" The danger was no longer abstract or potential. It was real and present. The intellectual climate was shifting. The brief window of relative tolerance that had characterized the High Renaissance was closing, slammed shut by the ferocious doctrinal battles of the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Copernicus could now see that his book would be born not into a world of curious scholars, but onto a battlefield where science, faith, and power were locked in a mortal struggle. The storm was coming, and he was running out of time. In 1542, with his health failing, the 70-year-old Copernicus finally made the fateful decision that would both immortalize his work and corrupt its meaning for generations. He entrusted the final, critical task of overseeing the printing of De Revolutionibus, not to the fiery and faithful Rheticus, but to a Lutheran theologian and preacher in Nuremberg named Andreas Osiander. The choice seemed logical at the time. Rheticus had to leave Nuremberg to take up a new teaching post in Leipzig, and Osiander was a respected scholar with experience in publishing mathematical texts. But this was a profound psychological error, a final tragic failure of judgment by the cautious astronomer. Copernicus, whose defining characteristic was a meticulous control over his own work, was now forced by distance and infirmity to place his life's meaning in the hands of another man. Osiander, for his part, was terrified. He admired the book's mathematics, but he was acutely aware of the theological firestorm it was likely to provoke. He feared it would bring scandal upon the printers and upon himself. Driven by this fear, he conceived of a plan to defuse the controversy. Without Copernicus's knowledge or consent, Osiander committed an act of astonishing intellectual sabotage. He wrote a short, anonymous preface titled, "To the Reader on the Hypotheses of this Work," and inserted it into the book right after the title page. In this preface, Osiander told a subtle but devastating lie. He claimed that the heliocentric model presented in the book was not intended as a description of physical reality. It was, he wrote, merely a hypothesis, a convenient mathematical fiction designed to make calculations easier, and not something that should be considered true or even probable. He was deliberately framing Copernicus's life's work as a clever computational trick, a thought experiment, stripping it of its revolutionary claim to describe the true physical structure of the universe. It was an act of well-intentioned cowardice, a preemptive surrender designed to placate the theologians and protect the author. The greatest catastrophe of Copernicus's story is one of profound and bitter irony. It is the moment of his ultimate triumph transformed into a moment of devastating betrayal. As the printing press in Nuremberg was turning out the first copies of De Revolutionibus, the book that was the culmination of his entire existence, its author was hundreds of miles away in Frombork, slipping into the final darkness. The physical book, the object he had held in his mind's eye for over 30 years, was a thing he would barely have a chance to touch. And when that book finally arrived, carried by messenger across half of Europe to his deathbed, it was a corrupted masterpiece. The unauthorized preface added by Andreas Osiander was a poison pill inserted at the very beginning of the text. It fundamentally misrepresented the entire purpose of Copernicus's life's work. He had not spent 3 decades meticulously calculating the motions of the planets to create a mere hypothesis. He was convinced he had discovered the actual physical truth of God's creation. The very heart of his revolution was the claim that the universe really is heliocentric. Osiander's preface was a lie that neutered this revolution at the moment of its birth. It told the world, "Pay no attention to the philosophical claims of this book. It is not truth. It is just a useful tool for accountants of the sky." The dying revolutionary was robbed of his revolution. The man who had waited a lifetime to speak his truth had his voice stolen and replaced with a timid whisper. This was the ultimate catastrophe, not the condemnation of the church, which would come later, but the betrayal by a well-meaning friend. A final, cruel twist of fate that ensured his work would be misunderstood and misread for more than half a century. The book that reached his hands was his child, but it had been dressed in the clothes of a coward before being presented to the world. The final act of Copernicus's personal drama was one of quiet, agonizing powerlessness. In the late months of 1542, just as Rheticus was delivering the precious manuscript to the printers in Nuremberg, Copernicus suffered a massive stroke. The chronicles of the time report it was an apoplexy, a cerebral hemorrhage that left him paralyzed down his right side, and most cruelly of all, robbed him of his memory and his mind. The great intellect that had rearranged the cosmos was now adrift, trapped inside a failing body. He lay in this state for months, a silent, helpless witness to the final chapter of his own story. He was completely cut off, unable to communicate, unable to protest, unable to defend his work. While Osiander was making the fateful decision to write his deceitful preface, Copernicus was powerless to intervene. He could not write a letter, send a messenger, or issue a warning. The man who had lived his life with such caution and control had lost all control at the most critical juncture. This was the ultimate collapse. His body had failed him just as his life's work was taking physical form. This period of incapacitation was the last chance to prevent the great misunderstanding, and that chance was lost. The silence of the author became a vacuum, which Osiander's anonymous preface eagerly filled. Because Copernicus could not speak, the world assumed the preface spoke for him. It was taken as his own admission of the hypothetical nature of his work, a final retreat from the radical implications of his own theory. His enemies were given their best weapon not by his arguments, but by his silence. The collapse of his physical health led directly to the collapse of his work's philosophical integrity, allowing the lie of the preface to take root and define the initial reception of the greatest scientific achievement of the age. The end came in May of 1543. The final scene of Copernicus's life, as recounted by his friends and biographers, is a moment of cinematic, almost perfectly scripted poignancy. For months, the 70-year-old astronomer had been lying in a coma, his mind lost in the fog that separates life from death. His great book, the physical embodiment of his soul, had been making its slow journey from the printers in Nuremberg back to the cold shores of the Baltic. It finally arrived in Frombork on or around the 24th of May. According to the legend, which is too beautiful not to be true, his friends brought the newly printed volume into the death chamber and placed it in his hands. At that moment, as if summoned by the touch of his own creation, Copernicus is said to have awoken from his coma for a final, fleeting moment of lucidity. His eyes opened. He looked down and saw the book. He saw the title, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. He touched the cover, feeling the weight and substance of the pages that contained his entire world. In that instant, he knew that his work was done, that his secret was finally out, that his intellectual child had been born into the world. And then, having seen and touched the culmination of his life, he peacefully closed his eyes and passed away. His personal war, the long, lonely 30-year struggle against fear, tradition, and the immense weight of the past, was over. He died at the very instant his ideas became immortal. He would be spared the firestorm to come, the condemnations, the trials, the struggle of men like Galileo, who would have to fight for the truth he had uncovered. His final act was one of perfect, tragic timing, a quiet exit from the stage just as the thunderous drama he had authored was about to begin. The legacy of Copernicus is a story of conflict, a slow-burning revolution whose true nature was obscured for decades by the very act of cowardice meant to protect it. Osiander's preface was remarkably effective. For the better part of the next 70 years, De Revolutionibus was not widely seen as a revolutionary text, but as a highly technical mathematical treatise. It was read, studied, and used by the best astronomers and mathematicians in Europe, but primarily as a hypothetical tool. They used Copernicus's superior models and tables to calculate planetary positions and reform the calendar, all while dismissing the physical reality of a moving Earth as a philosophical absurdity. It was a strange dual existence. The book was essential for its practical mathematics, but ignored for its cosmological truth. This was the first interpretation, Copernicus, the brilliant calculator. The conflict of interpretations began as a new generation of astronomers, armed with new instruments and a new willingness to challenge authority, looked past the preface and engaged with the radical core of the work. The Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, while rejecting a moving Earth, was forced by Copernicus's work to abandon the ancient Ptolemaic system, proposing his own hybrid model. But it was his brilliant, mystically inclined assistant, Johannes Kepler, who would take the next decisive step. Using Tycho's incredibly precise data, Kepler discovered that the planets did not move in perfect circles, as Copernicus had believed, but in ellipses. In doing so, he corrected Copernicus. But more importantly, he proved that the heliocentric system, when properly understood, was a true physical system. The final, explosive confirmation came from Italy. In 1610, Galileo Galilei pointed his newly constructed telescope at the heavens and saw things no human had ever seen before: mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus, and 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. This was the smoking gun. The moons of Jupiter proved that not everything orbited the Earth. The phases of Venus were impossible in the Ptolemaic system, but perfectly explained in the Copernican one. Galileo's observations transformed Copernicanism from a mathematical theory into an observable fact. And it was at this moment, when the theory became undeniable, that the Catholic Church, now in the full throes of the Counter-Reformation, finally acted. In 1616, De Revolutionibus was officially placed on the index of forbidden books, pending correction. Copernicus the calculator was dead. Copernicus the heretic had been born. We can now finally return to the central paradox and give the comprehensive answer to our core question. Why did a monk, a man of the Church, dare to overturn the universe? The answer is that he was, in his soul, more of a Greek philosopher and a Renaissance mathematician than a medieval priest. His revolution was not born of rebellion, but of a deeply conservative, almost religious quest for perfection. Copernicus did not set out to challenge God. He set out to better understand the mind of God. He was driven by a profound Pythagorean faith that the language of creation was mathematics, and that this language must be beautiful, elegant, and harmonious. When he looked at the Ptolemaic universe, he saw a system that was functional but ugly, a monster, as he himself called it. He believed this clumsiness was an insult to the perfection of the divine creator. His life's work was an attempt to restore this divine harmony, to clean up the cosmos and reveal its true, underlying mathematical beauty. He found the answer not in new observations. He was a competent, but not a groundbreaking observer, but in the ancient, half-forgotten texts of Greek thinkers like Aristarchus of Samos, who had proposed a heliocentric system nearly 2,000 years earlier. He was a conservative revolutionary, a man looking backward to the wisdom of the ancients to solve a modern problem. He was also a man of profound faith, but his faith was in a rational, logical God who would not have created a universe of such arbitrary complexity. In his dedication to Pope Paul III, which he wisely placed after Osiander's preface, he makes his true purpose clear. He presents his work not as an attack on the Church, but as a gift to it, a better way to calculate the calendar and to appreciate the divine art of the Creator. He was a man who, in seeking to build a more perfect model of God's heaven, accidentally shattered the foundations of the medieval world and dethroned humanity from its center. The paradox is solved thus. The most radical act in the history of science was carried out by a cautious, conservative man, not in a fit of rebellious fervor, but as an act of profound aesthetic and intellectual devotion. The verdict of history is that the life of Nicolaus Copernicus teaches a lesson far more profound than the mere arrangement of the planets. His work was the genesis of a principle, now called the Copernican principle, or the principle of mediocrity, which has become a foundational concept of the modern scientific worldview. The lesson is one of progressive and radical humility. Copernicus did not just move the Earth. He initiated a cascade of discoveries that have systematically removed humanity from its self-proclaimed position of cosmic importance. He showed that our planet is not the center of the universe, but just one of several planets orbiting a rather ordinary star. In the centuries that followed, his intellectual descendants would continue this process of cosmic demotion. Astronomers revealed that our Sun is just one of hundreds of billions of stars in a galaxy called the Milky Way, which is itself just one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in a vast, expanding universe. Then Charles Darwin delivered the biological equivalent of the Copernican revolution, showing that humans are not a special, divine creation, but a single branch on the vast, sprawling tree of evolution, intimately related to every other living thing on our planet. In the 20th century, Sigmund Freud proposed that we are not even masters of our own minds, but are driven by dark, irrational forces lurking in our subconscious. Each of these discoveries was a blow to human arrogance, a dismantling of our cherished sense of uniqueness. This is the ultimate and perhaps unsettling lesson of Copernicus's life. The universe does not revolve around us. We are not the centerpiece of creation, but perhaps just a temporary and accidental audience to a cosmic spectacle of unimaginable scale and indifference. His legacy is not a map, but a mindset, a willingness to accept our true, humble place in the cosmos. He taught us that the pursuit of truth often requires the courage to abandon our most comforting and self-aggrandizing illusions. The final frame, the delicious kebab that lingers on the palate, is the powerful, vertigo-inducing image of our own world as seen from a great distance. Before Copernicus, the Earth was not a planet. It was the foundation. It was the firm, unmoving, absolute floor of existence, the stable stage upon which the entire divine drama played out. It was home. After Copernicus, that foundation is gone. The Earth is revealed for what it is, a small, fragile sphere of rock and water, spinning at 1,000 miles per hour on its axis, hurtling at 67,000 miles per hour in its orbit around the Sun. It is a speck of dust, a pale blue dot, as a later astronomer would call it, adrift in a silent, shoreless ocean of black. The quiet canon from Frombork did not just give us a new astronomical model. He gave us a new existential condition. He gave us the terrifying and exhilarating feeling of homelessness, the profound sense that we are living on a projectile with no guarantees, no special status, and no firm ground beneath our feet. The shadow of his tower in Frombork stretches across the centuries, and it touches every one of us. It is the shadow of doubt, the shadow of inquiry, the shadow that forces us to look up at the night sky, not with the placid certainty of the ancients, but with a mixture of awe, wonder, and a deep, unsettling humility. The flame of his idea, once a tiny, secret candle flickering in a lonely tower, has grown into a bonfire that illuminated the scientific revolution and burned away the old, comfortable cosmos forever. The final image is one of motion, our world, no longer the center of anything, but finally free, spinning silently in the infinite, cold, and beautiful darkness, forever searching for its place among the stars.